Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They say parents are supposed to be proud of you when you graduate, supposed to show up, supposed to cheer for you when you cross that stage, supposed to celebrate the years of hard work and sacrifice that led up to that moment. I wouldn't know. Mine had a party to attend instead. I woke up that morning feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness, the kind that sits heavy in your chest, making it impossible to stay still for too long. The day I had been waiting for was finally here, the day I had spent years working toward, the day I had dreamed about every time I stayed up late studying, every time I doubted myself, every time I wondered if I would even make it. It was supposed to feel special, supposed to be the kind of day that I would look back on for the rest of my life, supposed to be the moment my parents looked at me with pride and told me that all my hard work had been worth it. But even as I got dressed, even as I smoothed out my graduation gown, even as I pinned my cap carefully onto my hair, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite shake, a creeping doubt that whispered, "Don't get your hopes up." Still, I checked my phone, my fingers hesitating for a moment before I opened my messages, scanning through my notifications, looking for something, anything, that would tell me they were on their way. But there was nothing. No missed calls, no texts, no excited messages from my mother telling me how proud she was, no simple good luck from my father, no acknowledgement that today was the most important day of my life so far. I told myself they were probably just running late, that they were busy getting ready, that they would show up just in time, that they wouldn't actually miss this, that they wouldn't actually let me walk across that stage without them there. I told myself not to panic, not to be disappointed, not to assume the worst, but deep down, I already knew the truth. And then, just as I was about to put my phone down, just as I was about to give up on hearing from them before the ceremony, a notification lit up my screen, a text from my mother. For a brief second, I let myself feel relief, let myself believe that this was the moment she would say they were on their way, that this was the moment I had been waiting for, that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong to doubt them. But then I read the message. "We are so proud of you, sweetheart, but we just can't make it. We're swamped this weekend. We'll celebrate soon, promise. Love you." I stared at the words, reading them over and over again, waiting for them to change, waiting for the meaning to shift, waiting for something to make it hurt less. But it didn't change, it didn't shift, it didn't hurt less, it just confirmed what I had already known all along. They weren't coming. They hadn't forgotten, hadn't lost track of time, hadn't been caught up in something unavoidable. They had simply decided that my graduation wasn't worth the effort. I don't remember much of the ceremony itself, don't remember the speeches, don't remember the applause, don't remember the exact moment I walked across the stage and accepted my diploma. All I remember is standing there, looking out into the crowd, searching for faces that weren't there, feeling a hollowness settle deep inside me that I couldn't push away. I smiled for the photos, hugged my classmates, laughed when I was supposed to, but inside, something was breaking. It wasn't until later that night, when I was back in my apartment, exhausted and emotionally drained, that I finally let myself check social media, finally let myself see what had been more important than my graduation. And there it was. Post after post, picture after picture, bright and celebratory, a house filled with people, a table covered in expensive food, decorations, laughter, music, my parents standing beside my brother, their arms wrapped around him, their smiles wide, their expressions glowing with pride. A promotion party, a massive, extravagant, carefully planned event, thrown the same weekend as my graduation, the same day I had walked across that stage alone, the same moment I had been looking for them in the crowd. And just like that, everything clicked into place. They hadn't been swamped. They hadn't been busy. They hadn't been caught up in some unavoidable obligation. They had simply chosen Mark over me. Again. I stood there, staring at the photos of my parents celebrating Mark's big day while I had been nothing more than an afterthought, and that was the moment something inside me finally broke. The moment I saw those pictures, the moment I realized they hadn't just skipped my graduation, but had actually spent the same exact day celebrating Mark like he had done something so much more important, something so much more worthy of their attention, something so much more valuable than all the years I had spent working toward my degree, I felt something inside me crack, something deep, something that had been holding me together for years, but had finally reached its breaking point. I had spent so long convincing myself that maybe, just maybe, they didn't realize what they were doing, that maybe they weren't aware of how much it hurt, that maybe if I just tried harder, if I just achieved more, if I just gave them more reasons to be proud of me, then eventually, they would see me. But now, staring at my mother's beaming face in a picture where she was holding up a champagne glass to toast Mark's huge accomplishment, I realized the truth that had been right in front of me my entire life. It wasn't that they didn't see me. It was that they chose not to. I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers ached, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 things I wanted to say, 1,000 ways I wanted to scream at them, shake them, force them to understand what they had done. But all I could do was stare at the screen in stunned silence. A part of me wanted to let it go, wanted to just accept that this was who they were, that they were never going to change, that I should stop expecting anything different from them, but another part of me, the part that had spent years swallowing disappointment after disappointment, the part that had smiled through every time they made Mark their priority and left me in the background, the part that had been waiting for just one moment where I mattered more, refused to let it go without a fight. So, against my better judgment, against the part of me that already knew exactly how this was going to go, I called my mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and cheerful, still caught up in the high of the party, still completely oblivious to the fact that I was sitting in my apartment, feeling like my entire world had just caved in on itself. "Lauren, sweetheart. Oh my gosh, I was just about to call you. How was graduation? We're so proud of you." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to take a slow breath, forcing myself not to snap, not to let the rage that was bubbling inside me spill over, forcing myself to keep my voice steady even as my hands trembled with the effort. "You're proud of me?" I repeated, my voice coming out quieter than I expected, but sharp enough that I knew she would pick up on the edge. There was a pause, just a beat too long, just enough for me to know she had sensed that something was wrong, just enough for me to feel the first flicker of satisfaction at the realization that maybe, just maybe, she was finally going to feel even a fraction of what I had felt. "Of course we are, sweetheart," she finally said, her voice still light, still airy, still pretending like everything was fine. "Then why weren't you there?" Silence. Not long enough to be guilt. Not long enough to be shame. Just long enough to be mild inconvenience. And then, in the same tone she had used my entire life, the same dismissive, patronizing, indifferent tone that had made me feel like I was asking for too much every time I wanted to be seen, she let out a small sigh, like I was exhausting her. Like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the problem. "Sweetheart, we were just so busy with Mark's party. His promotion was a really big deal, you know. You'll understand one day." I think that was the moment I truly, finally broke. It wasn't the words themselves, because I had already known them before she said them. It wasn't even the fact that she wasn't apologizing, because I had already known she wouldn't. It was the way she said it, the way she brushed it off like it was nothing, the way she treated my pain like it was an inconvenience. "A really big deal," I repeated slowly, my voice eerily calm, my hands no longer shaking, my body no longer tense, because in that moment, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just done. "Of course it was, sweetheart. You know how hard he's worked." I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't beg her to see me. I just ended the call, set my phone down, and made a decision that I should have made years ago. That night, while the rest of my classmates were out celebrating with their families, while my parents were still at Mark's party drinking and laughing and toasting to his success, I sat in my apartment and started packing. I went through my things with a level of focus I had never felt before, moving through the motions without hesitation, throwing things into suitcases, making decisions without second-guessing, finally taking control of my own life. I wasn't going to give them another chance to hurt me, wasn't going to sit around waiting for the next time they decided I wasn't important enough, wasn't going to pretend I was ever going to be more than an afterthought in their world. By the time the sun came up, my apartment was nearly empty, my suitcases lined up by the door, my mind already made up. I had found a job in another city, had signed a lease on an apartment across the country, had taken every step necessary to build a life that had absolutely nothing to do with them. And just like that, I was gone. I didn't tell them. I didn't leave a note. I didn't give them the chance to talk me out of it, to gaslight me into thinking I was being dramatic, emotional, selfish, ungrateful. I just walked away. And when my best friend Rachel called me that night, when she asked me how I felt, when she told me she was proud of me, when she said I had finally done what I needed to do, I finally let myself breathe. "You're finally free," she said softly, and for the first time in my life, I believed it. If they wanted to act like I didn't exist, then fine. I was about to show them exactly what that felt like. The months that followed my decision to walk away felt like the kind of peace I never knew existed, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones when you no longer have to brace yourself for disappointment, the kind of freedom that comes when you stop waiting for people to love you the way you always wished they would. I had spent my entire life believing that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved myself enough, if I just achieved enough, then one day, my parents would finally see me the way they saw Mark, finally treat me like I was worth their time, finally choose me for once. But walking away, choosing myself instead of waiting for them to do it, was the most powerful thing I had ever done. I moved across the country, settled into a new job that I actually loved, surrounded myself with friends who celebrated my successes, built a life where my accomplishments weren't overshadowed by someone else's, where I wasn't constantly fighting to be noticed. It was strange, at first, to wake up in a world where I wasn't waiting for their approval, where I didn't have to measure myself against the impossible standard of being Mark. But every day that passed, I felt lighter, freer, more alive than I had ever been when I was living in their shadow. They hadn't tried to reach out. Not once. Not after they realized I had left. Not after they figured out I had changed my number. Not after I had erased every last trace of myself from their world. And honestly, that had told me everything I needed to know. But then, on a random evening, after months of absolute silence, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, the name missing, the sender unfamiliar, but the words unmistakably hers. "Lauren, sweetheart, please call me. We need to talk." For a long time, I just stared at the screen, my heart not racing, my hands not shaking, my stomach not twisting with dread the way it once would have. Months ago, a message like that would have sent me spiraling, would have made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, they had finally realized what they had done, finally felt the weight of what they had lost, finally understood that their absence had left a wound that had never stopped bleeding. But now, after everything, after the months of healing, after finally learning how to exist without needing them, all I felt was curiosity, a detached kind of amusement as I wondered what had changed. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I just waited. And it didn't take long before the next message came, this time longer, this time messier, this time drenched in the kind of desperation I had never heard from her before. "Lauren, I know you're upset, but we really need to talk. It's important. Please just call me, okay? It's about the family." The family. I almost laughed at that, at the sheer audacity of her acting like I was still part of something that had never actually included me, at the way she was suddenly reaching out after ignoring my existence for so long, at the fact that she actually expected me to care. But still, I said nothing, still I waited, still I let her sit in the silence she had once forced me to live in. And then, finally, after what must have been her breaking point, after realizing I wasn't going to respond just because she wanted me to, she finally sent the truth. "Lauren, please. We're in trouble. It's Mark. He made a bad investment, and we lost everything. Your father and I, we need help. We need you." I read the message slowly, carefully, letting each word settle, letting the reality of what she was saying sink in, letting the delicious, cruel irony of it wash over me in waves. Mark. The golden child. the one they had always placed on a pedestal, the one whose success had always mattered more than mine, the one whose promotion had been so important that it had been worth skipping my graduation. He had ruined them. And now, suddenly, I mattered. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, rereading the message, letting the weight of it settle in my chest, not as pain, not as sadness, not even as anger, but as power. They needed me now. And for the first time in my life, I finally had the upper hand. I stared at the message for a long time, rereading every desperate word, letting the sheer irony of it settle deep into my bones, letting myself absorb the fact that, after all this time, after years of being ignored, dismissed, and treated as if I was less important than the dirt beneath their feet, they suddenly needed me. Not because they had finally realized what they had done, not because they had woken up and felt the weight of their mistakes, not because they had missed me or regretted how they had treated me, but because their perfect son had ruined them. And now I was their only option. It would have been so easy to ignore them, so easy to delete the message, to block the number, to pretend like they didn't exist the same way they had always pretended I didn't exist. But as I sat there, staring at my mother's carefully chosen words, I felt something shift. A slow, deliberate kind of satisfaction curled in my chest, something dark, something calculating, something I never would have allowed myself to feel before. They had spent my entire life making me feel small. Now, it was my turn to make them feel helpless. So, I did exactly what I knew they were expecting. I played along. I responded with a simple message, just vague enough to keep them on edge, just kind enough to give them hope, just careful enough to make them believe they still had some level of control. I don't know, Mom. After everything, I don't think I can just forget how I was treated. But I'll think about it. And that was all it took. The floodgates opened instantly. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing nonstop, missed calls, texts, voicemails, as if they had been waiting, as if they had been holding their breath, as if they had already convinced themselves that I was going to save them. Sweetheart, we understand completely, and we know we've made mistakes, but we just want to make things right. Can we talk? Lauren, honey, we love you so much, and we're so sorry if we ever made you feel like you weren't important. That was never our intention. Please, let's put the past behind us. Lauren, it's your dad. I just want to say that I'm proud of you, and I wish we had told you that more often. Can we fix this? And then, as if on cue, Mark, the brother who had never apologized for anything in his life, the one who had spent years basking in the attention they had denied me, the one who had barely acknowledged my existence unless it benefited him, suddenly found it in his heart to reach out. Hey sis. I know we haven't always been close, but I miss you. I hate how things ended between us. Let's talk. I almost laughed at how transparent it all was, how quickly they had rewritten history in their heads, how easily they had flipped the script the second I had something they needed. It was pathetic, the way they had gone from ignoring my accomplishments to suddenly acting like they had always been proud. The way they had dismissed my pain for years only to turn around and expect me to forget everything because they had decided it was convenient for them now. But I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even bitter. Because for the first time in my life, I was the one in control. So, I let them believe it was working. I let them think they were pulling me back in. I let them convince themselves that their fake apologies, their forced affection, their sudden declarations of love were enough to make me forget. I responded to their messages just often enough to keep them hopeful, made just enough small talk to let them believe I was softening, asked just enough questions about their situation to keep them spilling details they thought would make me pity them. And they fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. Within days, the calls increased, the messages became longer, the guilt trips more carefully constructed. My mother started calling me every morning, checking in like she had been doing it my whole life, telling me how much she had missed our talks, how she wished things had been different, how she just wanted her family back together. My father followed suit, suddenly interested in my job, asking about my life, pretending like he had always cared, pretending like he had ever once made an effort to be part of it. And Mark, who had never needed me for anything, Mark, who had always been the one in charge, the one in control, the one who held all the power, was suddenly humble, suddenly kind, suddenly trying to act like a good brother. I messed up, Lauren. I should have been a better sibling. I should have looked out for you more. I don't blame you if you hate me, but I just want us to be okay again. It was almost admirable how far they were willing to go, how easily they were able to rewrite history, how effortlessly they could convince themselves that none of it had ever happened, that they had always been the loving, devoted family they were now pretending to be. But I remembered. I remembered the empty seat at my graduation. I remembered the party they threw for Mark instead. I remembered every time I had waited for their love and been met with indifference. And no amount of fake kindness was ever going to erase that. So, I let them believe it. I let them think I was slipping back into the role they had assigned me, let them feel the relief of thinking they had won, let them think they still had control. Because the longer I played along, the sweeter it would be when I finally took it all away. They thought they had me back in their control. But they had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings now. The flight home felt different than any trip I had ever taken before, not just because I was returning to the place I had spent years trying to escape, not just because I was stepping back into a world that had never once felt like it truly belonged to me, but because this time, for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one at a disadvantage. This time, I wasn't the forgotten daughter chasing after scraps of love, wasn't the second-place sibling waiting for crumbs of attention, wasn't the girl desperately hoping to be chosen. This time, they needed me. This time, I was the one holding all the power. I had let them believe it was working, let them think I was coming around, let them build up the fantasy in their heads that I was going to swoop in and fix everything, that I was going to be their savior, that I was the dutiful daughter who had finally forgiven them. My mother had practically burst into tears when I told her I was flying back. My father had called me 3 times that night just to tell me how proud he was, and Mark, who had spent years basking in their undivided attention while I had been nothing more than an afterthought, had actually said the words I had never thought I would hear from him. I don't deserve your help, Lauren, but I really appreciate you giving us a chance to fix this. It had almost been enough to make me laugh. But instead, I played along, nodding when I was supposed to, making just enough small talk to keep them comfortable, letting them believe they were still pulling the strings, still in control, still able to mold me into the version of myself they had always wanted. By the time I arrived at my parents' house, they were practically vibrating with anticipation, my mother already reaching for me the second I stepped through the door, pulling me into a hug so tight, so desperate, so fake that I had to physically stop myself from recoiling. My father clapped a hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with a forced kind of warmth, as if he had convinced himself that this was some kind of long-overdue family reunion rather than a last-ditch effort to save themselves. Mark was already seated at the dining room table, his hands clasped together, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the barely hidden anxiety in his posture, the way he was trying so damn hard to pretend he wasn't completely at my mercy. "We're just so happy you're here, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice trembling with forced emotion, her eyes already glistening, as if she thought a few tears were going to make me forget everything. I smiled, slow and deliberate, letting them believe I was feeling just as sentimental as they were pretending to be. "I've missed you guys too," I said softly, and if the words tasted like poison in my mouth, they didn't need to know that. They wasted no time diving into their carefully crafted speeches, my mother going on and on about how much she regretted everything, how much she wished things had been different, how she never meant to make me feel like I wasn't important. My father followed suit, talking about how family is all that really matters, how mistakes had been made but could be forgiven, how they were ready to move forward. And then, of course, came the real reason I was here. "We don't expect you to fix this for us," my mother said, sniffling dramatically, clutching my father's hand as if she was playing the role of the broken woman barely holding it together. "But if you could just help us get back on our feet, just something small to keep us going, we could figure the rest out," my father added, nodding as if he had already decided I was going to say yes. Mark, ever the opportunist, leaned forward, his voice softer, more measured, the way it always was when he was trying to convince people he was the reasonable one. We just need enough to cover the mortgage for a little while, he said, as if he hadn't been the one to make the reckless financial decision that ruined them. I let this silence stretch between us, let them sit in their own desperation, let them squirm for just a few moments longer before I finally looked my mother in the eye, letting the mask slip just enough for her to see exactly what was coming. You know, Mom, you told me something a while back that I've been thinking about a lot lately, I said, keeping my voice light, keeping my expression unreadable. She blinked, confused for just a moment before forcing another smile. Of course, sweetheart. What was it? I leaned forward slightly, just enough to watch as their hopeful expressions began to flicker with the first hints of doubt. You told me that some things are just more important. Silence. Pure, unfiltered, suffocating silence. My mother's face paled, her eyes widening just slightly as my father stiffened beside her, as Mark finally exhaled, the weight of what I was saying hitting all three of them at once. They knew. They knew exactly what I was about to do. And I thought about that a lot, I continued, tilting my head slightly, letting the words sink in, letting the weight of their own neglect, their own choices, their own damn words crush them the way they had once crushed me. And I realized you were right. I stood up, smoothing out my jacket, grabbing my purse, watching as panic finally set in, watching as my mother reached for me, watching as my father opened his mouth to say something, anything, that would change my mind. Lauren, please, my mother gasped, her voice cracking, as if she suddenly understood that this wasn't just a bad dream, that this wasn't just another moment where they could guilt me into compliance. We didn't mean it, my father stammered, his composure slipping, his face flushed with something that almost looked like fear. Mark just sat there, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table, silent for the first time in his life. I stepped back, my hand already on the door handle, my voice as calm as it had ever been. I'm sure you'll figure it out, I said smoothly, offering them the same casual indifference they had once shown me. And then I walked out. I didn't look back. Didn't give them a second chance. Didn't let them have another word. Because for the first time in my life, they finally knew what it felt like to be discarded. And I had never felt lighter. The flight back home felt different this time, lighter somehow, like I had shed a weight I hadn't even realized I had been carrying for years, like I had finally cut the last remaining thread that had tied me to a family that had never truly been mine. I had spent so much of my life waiting for them to see me, waiting for them to choose me, waiting for them to finally treat me like I was worth something, but after everything that had just happened, after watching the pure panic in my mother's eyes, after hearing the crack in my father's voice, after seeing Mark sit there in stunned silence for the first time in his life, I knew deep in my bones that the waiting was over. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I wasn't hoping they would change. I wasn't looking for a way back in. For the first time, I was the one closing the door. I had barely unpacked my bags when my phone buzzed from across the room, the sound breaking the comfortable quiet of my apartment, pulling my attention toward the screen where an all-too-familiar number flashed across the display. I didn't need to open it to know exactly what it was, didn't need to read the words to know exactly what my mother had written, didn't need to hear her voice to know that whatever she had to say, it wasn't an apology. But still, despite everything, I picked up the phone. Not to answer, just to read. Lauren, I don't understand why you're doing this to us. I know we've had our issues, but we are still your family. I raised you. I gave you everything I could. I did the best I knew how, and now you're just turning your back on us? Do you even realize how cruel you're being? Do you even care what you're doing to us? We need you. I don't know how else to make you see that. Just come home. Let's fix this. I let out a slow breath, my eyes scanning over the words, not feeling the anger I might have expected, not feeling the sadness I once would have drowned in, not feeling anything but a quiet, unshakable certainty. She hadn't said she was sorry. She hadn't admitted what they had done. She hadn't even acknowledged that she had ever hurt me, hadn't recognized that her choices, her actions, her blatant favoritism had left scars that no amount of begging could erase. She hadn't even tried to understand why I had walked away, hadn't even attempted to make things right, because in her mind, she had done nothing wrong. To her, this was about control. To her, I was just being cruel. To her, I was the one turning my back on them. To her, my entire life, my entire existence, my entire purpose had always been about how I fit into her world, how I could serve them, how I could be useful to them, how I could be another extension of Mark's success. She didn't want me back because she loved me. She wanted me back because they needed something from me. And now that I wasn't giving it to them, now that I wasn't following the script, now that I had finally chosen myself over them, now that I had finally broken the cycle, she was grasping at anything she could to pull me back in. But I wasn't going back. Not this time. Not ever again. I exhaled slowly, feeling the last remnants of guilt dissolve into nothing, feeling the last lingering pieces of obligation slip away, feeling the weight of their expectations finally fall off my shoulders. Then, without hesitation, without a second thought, I blocked the number. And just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something light, something freeing, something I had never felt before. Peace. I set the phone down, glancing toward the desk in the corner of my apartment, my eyes landing on the framed diploma that sat there, the one they had never cared about, the one they had never shown up for, the one they had dismissed as less important. I ran my fingers over the glass, tracing the letters of my name, the name that had once felt so insignificant in their world, but now felt like it belonged entirely to me. I had done this. I had built this life. I had succeeded without them, and I had never needed their approval to do it. I smiled, a real, genuine smile, one that wasn't hiding anything, one that wasn't weighed down by years of waiting for love that had never come, one that finally felt like it belonged to me. But then, just as I was about to turn away, just as I was about to move on, my eyes landed on something else, a small, battered shoebox tucked away in the back of my closet, half buried beneath old clothes, forgotten for years, but never quite discarded. I hesitated, my breath catching slightly as I walked over, as I knelt down, as I carefully pulled it out and lifted the lid, revealing a handful of old photographs, each one more painful than the last. There they were. My parents. Mark. Me. A family that had never truly been mine. A family that had never truly wanted me. A family I had spent my whole life chasing, only to realize too late that they had never been running toward me in return. I held one of the photos in my hands, staring at the smiling faces, at the memories that were never quite as happy as they looked, at the people I had finally let go of. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the need to burn it, didn't feel the need to rip it up, didn't feel the need to erase it from existence. Because it didn't matter anymore. Because it wasn't mine anymore. Because I was done. I placed the photo back inside the box, closed the lid, locked it away in the closet, and walked forward without looking back.